I reflected this morning as I turned on the radio to hear the weather forecast on the peculiar appropriateness of our discussing autonomy and the right to die on Bastille Day. Because there is no better point in the history of contemporary debate at which to begin our reflections on the rhetoric of the right to die than that which was symbolized in the Enlightenment and its revolutions. And the rhetoric of the right to die makes a fascinating study. For in the human rights vernacular of the late 20th century, itself, of course, a flowering of the humane values of Western civilization, even if a secular flowering of those values, it seeks to assert a principle which would set the combined morals and jurisprudence of this millennium and the last upon its head. Of course, the syllogism, once put, seems to be impenetrable. In the great questions of life, surely I may decide for myself the time and the means of my dying. Surely is the greatest of all the questions of life. Therefore, I have the right to die, and no one may take it from me. Who are you who would keep me alive against my will? Well, we come back to this shortly, and I want to make three outline points to you this morning. The first is this. We need to note that the phrase "the right to die" is itself a considerable curiosity. For one thing, it seems to assert as a right something which is an inevitable feature of human experience. For death is surely universal. The Bible's reiterated refrain, "and he died," continues to punctuate the passage of the generations, as every he and even every she lays final claim to obsequies in the community and obituary in the press. We die, and the fact is noted. Indeed, there are parallels between the rhetorical role of the right to die and of that other ambiguous right which was more in evidence in debate 20 years ago than now, the rhetorical right proclaimed in the propaganda of socialism, the right to work. The parallel, of course, is incomplete, because it is perfectly possible to go all the way from the cradle to an experience of the final human right, the right to die, without actually experiencing the dignity and the indignity of human labor. But the right to work does not imply a state-mandated policy of full employment, parce the socialist argument. It implies an opportunity, cateris paribus, to take up employment if one has what employment needs: energy, qualifications. And if opportunity presents, without public policy standing in the way and declaring "thou shalt not work." Now, by the same token, the right to die is, if we wish to couch it as a human right, that one with most universal exercise. As George Bernard Shaw put it, it is the ultimate statistic that 1 out of 1 dies. No one, so far as I know, has taken a stand with some bioethical King Canute and declared "thou shalt not die," unless perhaps it was the serpent in the garden. This debate is not about whether we have the right to die. Ergo, it is about something else. Now, at the same time, as well we know, the claim put forward in the syllogism is one from which those who promote it, as soon as they have enunciated it, begin to draw back. This is perhaps one of the strangest features of contemporary bioethical debate. Because the argument once put, for all its apparent sureliness, who can doubt it, proves altogether too much. And this takes us right to the heart of the practical debate about the right to die and public policy. For the radicals, for whom this is a battle cry, are actually much less radical than they seem. In deploying the logic of a radical libertarianism to support their demand for some form of voluntary euthanasia / assisted suicide, they discover that they have let the suicide genie out of the bottle, and they immediately exercise themselves at great length, and it seems to some of us at much inconvenience to their case, to push him back in again. And on the assumption that genies are merely male, I can say that. The libertarian syllogism says nothing in itself about all the public policy stuff we then have offered to us to mitigate the significance of the argument itself. Nothing about 6 months to live, intolerable suffering, the good faith judgment of 2 physicians, let alone some calculus of social cost, or it may be life membership in the Hemlock Society. Whatever other bureaucratic controls are proposed, as favored by those who pose as the reasonable proponents of the right to die and a euthanasia regime. The charm, the simplicity of the suicide syllogism. My life is my own. My death is the most important thing in my life. I have the right to die. The charm and simplicity of this suicide syllogism, if so I may call it, with its correlated arguments, which of course would recruit physicians or others to aid or effect the process, have little bearing, if any bearing, on the convoluted proposals of public policy, which are somehow held to flow from its conclusion, and which bear all the hallmarks of social control and bureaucracy knows best. Hardly libertarian themes. Part of the problem, of course, with the proposal of a voluntary euthanasia regime lies precisely here. And while it is plain that these controls would greatly mitigate the ill effects of what otherwise would be a suicide's charter, and it is worth saying that there are probably very few of us who at some point or other in our experience have not contemplated self-destruction in moments of extreme distress. And which is why there are no serious proponents in public policy of encouragement of or legitimation of suicide as something other than a bureaucratically controlled process in the context of medicine. Part of the problem with the proposal of a voluntary euthanasia regime lies precisely here, in the fundamentally anti-libertarian proposals which suddenly come in chapter 2 of the proposal, as they bureaucratize the application of the right to die on principles which would seem to enshrine the very opposite of those with which the syllogism itself is concerned. That is to say, the practical case for euthanasia on the ground of the right to die changes its clothes midway through the discussion. It is initially libertarian in setting out its assault on the tradition, but then, having believed it has undermined the taboo on self-killing, or requiring others to kill oneself, we find a classic civil service mindset taking over. It is for the community, and therefore for the state, to determine whether you have the grounds on which to exercise your right to die, and whether those grounds lie in the convoluted pronouncements of the Dutch courts, or in the criteria of the Oregon legislation, or of what has now been passed in the Australian Northern Territory. Wherever the particulars of those criteria may lie, the right to die is delivered from the declaration of this free Enlightenment individual into the hands of those who control the bureaucracy and who make decisions about what is good for the people. The practical implication, of course, which is so deeply disturbing, which seems unconvincing to libertarians who begin with their argument and wish to stick with it, is that we have moved from giving the right to die to the individual who claims it to be his or hers, and instead we have given it to the state, which may determine the criteria according to which the right may be exercised. That is to say, the candidate for death must both wish to exercise the right and, as it were, have his or her application approved. There must be socially valid reasons for death. Since there is almost no interest in a mere charter for suicide, this second-guessing by the community lies at the heart of contemporary euthanasia proposals. And in policy terms, it of course proves to be their Achilles heel. For it moves from the individual to the state the responsibility for death. It grants the state powers which, in our culture, it has never before legitimately been able to claim to authorize innocent killing. And in moving from the libertarian suicide axis to one of life not worth living / death seems a good idea, it demonstrates the innate connection of voluntary and involuntary euthanasia. And that, and for those unfamiliar with this discussion, that needs to be underlined as the fundamental argument against voluntary euthanasia, the inherent connections between all proposals for voluntary and involuntary euthanasia, that for all the seeming principial separation, they are in fact, in public policy terms, quite inseparable. For the state is then confronted with the question, first, of the incompetent patient who displays those same symptoms which are on the approved list of euthanasia indicators, and then the competent patient with the same symptoms who has not elected to apply. It is important to note that this argument is not simply about the potential for abuse in the bureaucratization of decisions for the killing of innocent persons. It is an argument about the logic of the justification for euthanasia in public policy. The suicide syllogism, which would claim the right to die as a human right, does not therefore provide any justification for the social euthanasia regimes which are currently being initiated and touted throughout the West. It offers clear-cut rationale for a right of suicide, and by extension a possible right to be killed, on the basis of an individual's judgment about his or her own life, as his or her own story, to be told in his or her own terms. We know the rhetoric of the argument. While it is used as an argument in favor of social euthanasia, together with some kind of appeal to compassion, which of course constitutes the other plank of such a case, social euthanasia regimes must seek legitimacy in that place where their operating principles lie, in a claimed right of the state to approve individual acts of suicide, and more fundamentally, because suicide can never be an adequate term for a publicly authorized act, and because where a medical attendant or relative is involved, we have euthanasia, which is by definition the killing of another, even if it may also be considered to be suicide, a claimed right of the state to authorize the killing of the innocent, that is, to sponsor homicide. How little connection that has with the right to die syllogism and its libertarian assumptions is not hard to see. So first, that outline argument about the way in which the right to die case is used in seeking to advance public policy proposals for euthanasia. Secondly, to return to the original claim, so redolent of the emerging social assumptions of our culture, as it seeks to reinvent itself in the aftermath of the supposed collapse of the Judeo-Christian tradition. The right to die assumes the liberty of the individual to control his or her own self, above all, in this final choice. Its revolutionary character in policy and morals is evident in the fact that the settled assumption of our culture has explicitly denied that very claim. It is one of the basic strands of Western law and morals that the right of self-killing is denied. And if one was seeking to characterize Western culture over against other cultures, this would be one of the chief identifiers of its understanding of human nature. The settled public policy proscription of suicide has been universal and vigorous in the West. In its secular form, it long took the view that the citizen was a subject of the monarch and had no liberty to dispose of him or herself for that single reason. Behind this, of course, lay a theological justification for suicide as sin and the final authorization for such a view of the relationship of monarch and subject in the assertion that the Lord gives and the Lord takes away, in the pivotal phrase of the apostle, which couldn't have been better designed as an antidote to right to die rhetoric. You are not your own. You are not your own. And whether you belong to God in redemption, as of course the apostle here specifically intends, or simply in creation, as he could equally have said, and as you have in Psalm 24 and elsewhere, whether you belong to the monarch as your feudal lord, or whether, if you feel yourself sniggering here in Republican America at the thought, whether in terms of contemporary jurisprudence the state has an interest in the life of the citizen, which is of course a carbon copy of the same position, the principle is one. And the question, if we may so put it, which lies back of all this argument, is whether we are indeed our own. Are you yours to dispose as you see fit? Or are you, as well as yours, also another's? Whether that other is your community, or your monarch, or your God. We should note that there are many levels at which this kind of argument can be pursued. We don't have to persuade people of full-blooded redemptive theism to make the point. To counter the radical autonomy case, this hardcore right-to-die position, all we need to do is to demonstrate that you are not finally your own, that others have a claim on you, or that, if we can put it in this way, and this has been part of the settled assumption of the Western tradition, suicide is not finally a private act, but a public act in the center of the community. That is all we have to argue. And it is not a hard argument to make. Thirdly, the movement for the right to die can ironically be seen as a demand not so much to be able to die, which is of course a universal experience, but rather to be able to avoid dying. Or, if you like, also that analogy of dying which we find in the experience of chronic disease. Now, my point, of course, is that there are two different sets of senses in which we use the term die. We use the term die of being dead. And so we say of X, he has died, by which we mean his life has come to an end and he now is dead. Secondly, of course, we use this as an experience, as a way of describing the experience of moving from health, or some approximation to health, to the position of being dead. And here we use the term dying as a way to refer to the experience. Now, of course, it's perfectly possible for the experience of dying to be so contracted in the case of a traumatic accident, let us say, as to be insignificant, that you move from being alive and not dying to being dead in a single moment of experience. Or so we hope as we take bumpy flights out of O'Hare from time to time. The claim of the right to die may therefore be construed rather as a rather specific right not to be involved in the process of dying, which of course is an inherently passive process, in which the weakness and disintegration of the flourishing of human life is uppermost in our experience. And again, in parentheses, not to be involved in the experience of serious chronic disease, which seems to me to have a fundamental analogy with the dying process, even if it may be stable and long-term. But to move instead directly from a state of health to a state of being dead, without, as it were, having to die at all. The movement for the right to die as a protest against the experience of dying as that transitional and altogether characteristic element in the human life story, in which we are confronted by our mortality, consciously or unconsciously, as we experience the severe bodily and it may be mental degradation which bridges the experience of healthy human life with the experience of death. Now, we can make more of that argument. It seems to me it helps to illustrate the cultural context in which this movement, which even a generation ago was essentially an eccentric movement in the mainstream of Western politics and cultural thinking, which has helped project it into a serious political option and a threat to our medical culture and the public policy framework within which medicine operates. I think it helps direct our attention to the withdrawal from candid confrontation with mortality, which of course has been drawn to our attention in many other aspects of contemporary culture. It explains how it is that it now seems, as the process of dying is extended, as of course so much fear and mistrust has been generated by accounts of overtreatment, by the whole mythology of the mechanical extension of human life, with true basis and with all sorts of exaggeration attached, as this has shed abroad in the culture at that very time, in the culture at which there has been a decisive move away from the kind of self-understanding and idea of human identity within which mortality could be confronted. It is often said it is a curiosity that those who have no hope in the life to come seem so ready now to terminate the experience of human life here so readily, so quickly, instead of, as one might have expected, seeking to draw it out to the last drop of human experience. Well, of course, our surprise depends partly on our assumption, which is being denied, that life is inherently a good. We are displaying the extent to which we are still caught in our own tradition when we express that surprise. Because the alternative which lies behind this kind of thinking is that only life which experiences all sorts of other goods, which enables the individual to experience all sorts of good things, may be considered itself an unqualified good, and that life with a certain number of disadvantages attached, whatever kind of calculus is being applied, has essentially a negative quality, such that it would be better for that individual if he or she had ended his or her life, preferably without the passive, uncontrolled experience of dying as a deliberate decision and the outcome of which will be death at a time and place and in a manner of his or her choice. But we are thrown back by this reflection upon the broader cultural religious situation. And I would like to make 3 brief points in conclusion in which we reflect upon that broader question. Because, of course, if we ask ourselves why it is that the right to die rhetoric, which does seem on examination to be so patently flawed, why it is that this rhetoric has attracted so much conviction, has motivated so many people, has begun to commend itself in a whole series of Western jurisdictions, both to those people who don't think and don't know very much, and also to growing numbers of those who do think and who do know. And traditionally, there's always been more popular support for euthanasia than there has been informed support. But it does seem as if that is beginning, the gap is beginning to close. If we ask ourselves why this rhetoric carries such conviction, if it is indeed so flawed, the answer lies, as it were, in the necessity of these alternative ways of thinking in the context of a culture which is in collapse and which is being repudiated. If the alternative is to buy back into the frameworks of Judeo-Christian understanding, if that is the alternative, then for all sorts of personal, religious, cultural, political reasons, there are increasingly those who would rather opt for the flawed argumentation of the right to die and for its supposed but in fact contradicted high notions of human liberty. That is to say, this debate is only at one level a debate about our control over our dying. It is, of course, plainly a debate, first of all, about the meaning of death and the meaning, therefore, of dying. And insofar as there is any settled understanding of what these things can mean, for all their personal grief and trauma, whether there is any meaning in the experience of dying and the fact of death, the culture has begun to lose its hold on what that meaning might be. Now, Marshall was referring to Stanley Hauerwas, and some of us find his writing perhaps the most stimulating in this whole area, as he reflects upon the significance of suffering, the significance of handicap, the significance of dying. Many of us have had interests, medical and ethical and social, in the development of the hospice movement, which, as many of you will know, was a distinctly Christian enterprise in its first stages. Interestingly, the enterprise of Cicely Saunders, a remarkable lady, a British lady, who, perhaps most interestingly, was a nurse before she became a physician. And she put together her nursing and her Christian concerns as she began to devise a whole new way of looking at those who were beyond the help of therapeutic medicine. But we have begun to lose our hold on an idea of the meaning of death and dying, which hospice has in some ways helped to hang on to. As a culture, our hold is being loosed. It is not so much people believe death and dying to mean anything else than they have been taken to mean. It is that they are taken not to mean anything at all. Secondly, of course, and relatedly, we could speak about the meaning of suffering. And it's quite proper that we have withdrawn from some of the naiveties of finding meaning in suffering, which theologians and others have in the past too readily asserted. Again, Marshall was referring to Job's comforters. And first of all, the proper comfort that they brought when they sat down for 7 days and 7 nights, or was it 6, and said nothing at all. And as soon as they begin to open their mouths with theological constructs as the basis of their comfort for poor Job, things go from bad to worse. We have withdrawn from some of the platitudes and simplicities, although, of course, health and wealth preaching has pervaded far beyond those who are aware, particularly in North American evangelical Christianity, notions of our expectation that God will indeed somehow rescue us out of the experience of mortality. Extraordinary though they are on biblical grounds, because the Bible has many books, Job chief among them, devoted to arguing the precise contrary. These are remarkably pervasive in our culture, and I think will go far toward aiding the collapse of the sanctity of life position at the end of life among many of those who should know better. But we have lost touch with any kind of explanation of the meaning of suffering. Moving from naive explanations, Job's comforter explanations, we have moved also from the broader Jobian explanation that the meaning of suffering lies in the purposes of God. And having lost touch with any possibility of finding meaning in suffering, even that meaning, which was much of the burden of Greg Waybright's presentation last night, then of course suffering is something inherently meaningless, which is not what Job says. And if it's inherently meaningless, it is not something which we would ever find ourselves wishing to confront, because there is no strength with which to confront something which disturbs us and is inherently lacking in meaning. We may also comment that, of course, Job was taunted not least, aside from his comforters, by his wife who was left him when all his family was stripped from him. His wife who was, I have said elsewhere, would have been taken to be the patron saint of the Hemlock Society, did they but read their Bible. Job's wife who comes to him and says to him, libertarian, autonomous that she is, curse God and die. And Job says that she is foolish, and he, surely, having received good from the hand of God, will also receive evil as from his hand. But thirdly, these discussions of the meaning of death and the meaning of suffering, of course, resolve themselves finally into that basic question of the meaning of human being. And one reason why these discussions about bioethics are of such extraordinary significance for our culture is that that is their subject. Bioethics serves as the test bed, the laboratory in which the post-Christian view of human nature is being decided. Peep in, if you aren't into these things as a rule, peep into the bioethics journals, read what these people are saying to each other. You will discover them far ahead of what they typically say when they speak in public, on television, when they're interviewed in the press. These people, many of them are saying to each other altogether radical things about the reconstruction of our idea of human nature for a consistently post-Christian world. They are essentially engaged in the task, in the secular bioethics community, of the reconstruction of our understanding of human being. And of course, if we are reconstructing our idea of human being as our idea of what it is to be human discovers a harrowing trial of its understanding of itself, the question of death is at one pole, and the question of life is at the other. If we ask ourselves, on the one hand, as increasingly is being asked, how shall we define those who are truly alive, whether they are embryonic or fetal, or whether they are in persistent vegetative state, or advanced Alzheimer's, or whether they have some degree of physical or mental handicap, as the circle of the human race increasingly is being drawn tighter and tighter to decide who are truly alive as members of the human community, full members. Then at the other pole, the question of how we should control the dying process, how we should die, whether we should wish to die in the sense of dying rather than simply to be dead, and who will decide, is at the other, in a bipolar discussion about the very nature of human being. Now for us who believe that we are made in the image of God, being made in the imago Dei, standing coram Deo in the presence of God, as those who bear his image, these two little Latin phrases as the two supports of the high Western doctrine of human dignity, on which so much in our culture still unknowingly depends. The whole secular human rights discussion is itself 100% parasitic on the idea of human beings as made in the image of God. We who still believe that this is true have a special opportunity both to remind our fellow believers that this is true and what implications it has for how we shall live and how we shall die, and have an equally special opportunity and obligation to remind our culture of its own identity, where its own truest identity lies. And in the bioethics field, the threefold strand of professional, academic, and public policy debates, that their resolution finally lies only in a candid adherence to that high doctrine of humankind, which in the Judeo-Christian tradition and in medicine with its Hippocratic undergirdings has given us the settled assumptions of even one generation ago about how we should die and how we should live, which today we find to be increasingly in tatters. You are not your own, writes the Apostle. And those of us who believe we are not our own have a special opportunity and a special message to bring to those who, finding that they can no longer believe they are not their own, who have forgotten they are not their own, who believe they are only their own, entire to itself, an island in Donne's terms. Those who have come to believe that have, of course, discovered that as they seek to take full responsibility for themselves, as they seek to rise higher than the God who it was believed had made them, that they might take the reins wholly in their own hands, discover, as Adam discovered so many generations ago, that there is nowhere higher that you can go. However high you seek to go, if you seek to go above God, you simply find that you fall. And that the high dignity of humankind depends crucially on that high dignity which has been given it by God, who has made us to be little lower than the angels.